where are we headed with modern warfare? We have a history in this country of planning for the last war. We fought a war in Vietnam that, at least tactically, looked something like what we're doing now. And then we decided, we'll never do that again. And we got busy and we trained the best, what we would call conventional army in the world. And we used it very effectively. Desert Storm and the opening phase of Iraqi freedom proved there is and still is not another military that can stand up to U.S. forces in a conventional fight. But if you're the rest of the world, you've got to start thinking about, okay, we don't want to stand up and fight them in a tank battle in the desert. That's been proved pretty well. How do we want to fight Americans? And that will never change. If you look at what's happened with the IED fight, in 10 years, we have almost now, we have evolved from something that was a very simple device, a artillery round hooked to a wire, hooked to a car battery about 50 feet off in the bushes, to now something that they can detonate remotely from a remote location, very sophisticated devices, explosively formed projectiles, and that's because there's been a give and take. We went into Iraq with predominantly soft-side vehicles. Other than tanks, most of the vehicles were actually not armored vehicles. So they're being very effective with just a artillery round out there. Well, then we come up with armored vehicles. Well, then they start laying bigger explosives and coming up with more sophisticated detonation devices. So we come up with even bigger and better armored vehicles. So they come up with explosively formed projectiles. So we start targeting the network instead of trying to respond to the explosive. So it's an ongoing, constantly evolving, it's tit for tat. It's a thinking enemy. There are very likely to be conventional wars in the future. There are nations out there with large conventional armies who aren't necessarily our friends. But the likelihood is, diplomatically, those tend to be nations that we have some success deterring diplomatically. But there's probably also a large possibility that you'll continue to see engagements like what we're in now of what we used to call low intensity or counterinsurgency type conflicts that really is a thinking man's game. It's a chess match between our soldiers and theirs.
Colonel Anslow?
Yeah, thank you. I spent about 10 months at the U.S. Army War College asking that and trying to answer that exact question. And colonel after colonel has gone through there and tried to answer that same question. And it's a great question. Certainly, we guess at it every day. We try to formulate the response because the other piece of that is, how do we resource for the next war, and how do we finance the next war is always a question on the table. But Clausewitz, who wrote on war, it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed much. Where war is going. It's basically we're trying to, in a battle, put our will on the people of another person. And the question is, how much force are you willing to place on that other enemy? Politics will always be involved and has always been involved. Technology drives a lot of that capability as to how close we have to get to the enemy. And it's driving why Afghanistan and the Iraqi insurgents are not using that technology. They don't have it. They're not a force. They're not a government. So they've gone away from those conventional means of trying to shoot us down. There was never an aircraft, in Iraq. There's been no aircrafts, no air battles at all in Afghanistan. They've attempted to shoot us down, but they had nothing that could even go in the air and go to us air to air. Will that be in the next war? Probably not, because the enemy will most definitely dictate what that war looks like. If it's China, if it's Russia, if it's our friends, somebody we think is a friend now, but they become an enemy later, they'll probably have that technology, and it will be just a determination of how far are we willing to go to bend their people's will, their government's will. So where we go in the future, What the Army's position currently right now is anything goes. That we're funding and we're trying to organize and make sure we have conventional capability for conventional forces, as well as counterinsurgency operations, as well as low-intensity conflicts that we're talking about. So we have not taken anything off the table as to what the next war will be. We're certainly putting a lot of energy in the current fight, but no one knows for sure who that next one is. But I just say again, the enemy has a lot to do with what that ends up being. Cyberspace, absolutely. Cyber technologies out there. Well, and there's some that say, they're defeating our financial networks right now just through, a terrorist attack that happened in 2001, and are we still feeling the ramifications of that on Wall Street and things like that? So every component, you talk about the diplomatic, you talked about the informational, the military piece, and the economic piece. Those are all powers that we use to fight in our war. And military is just when it gets to the force-on-force type element. It could very well be one that we don't have to get to that at all. We don't have to ever put feet on the ground. I doubt it. I kind of think there'll always be a point where we have to put bodies into the potential face of the enemy in order to get it to the stopping point that we're hoping for.
Greg, do you want to add to that?
I don't know that there's much more that I can add. Just from my perspective, and I think there may be something of a misconception. War is the enemy of the warrior. We have always trained to deter. The mission of the Navy is not to fight wars at sea. The mission of the Navy is to deter war at sea, first and foremost. And I know that's the mission of the Army and the National Guard as well. We want to be the best that we can be, to plagiarize an old recruiting slogan. When I was a gunner's mate, what I told my people would say, my kids would say, why do we have to do this drill at 3 a.m.? I'd rather sleep. Well, we drill incessantly because we want to be the absolute best that we can be, so that we can win. And maybe of course I was in the Navy at the end of the Cold War. We were looking at the Russians, and what I told my kids was, when that Russian pilot takes off to attack our ship, I want him to know that he's not coming home, that he is not going to win. And maybe he'll develop engine malfunctions en route and have to divert. And then we won't have to, shoot him down. We won't have to kill him. That was always our objective, was to deter them